Peter is arrested again. All right, welcome back. Today we'll be studying in Acts chapter 12. Let's just jump right in. Verse 1. Now, about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. Chapter 12 begins with a return to the persecution of the early church. Worse yet, we see as James, the brother of John, was martyred. This would have been devastating to the early church, as James would have been the first of the 12 apostles to face such a death. One could easily imagine some form of idea that the apostles, some of whom had been arrested and miraculously released, were in some way immune to suffering. Yet even Jesus himself had warned them that they would suffer persecution for his namesake. Not even the apostles themselves would avoid such tribulation. The text even goes so far as to state that he was put to death with a sword. In other words, as gruesome as it is, he was likely beheaded. Historically speaking, however, we thankfully know that James's testimony was powerful even to the end of his life. According to the writings of the ancient historian Eusebius, Clement of Alexandria had relayed that even the soldier tasked with guarding James was affected by his witness, so much so that, again, according to Clement via Eusebius, that same soldier became a Christian himself and died alongside James for the sake of the gospel. Verse 3. When he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. When he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So Peter was kept in the prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. While Herod wasn't the first to persecute the early Christians, he held a differing motive than that of at least some who had come before. Saul, prior to his Damascus Road experience of witnessing the risen Jesus and being changed, he persecuted the early church out of a sincerely held but misguided belief that he was doing the will of God. Granted, while it was still wrong to commit and oversee the acts which he did, his belief was that this cell of, in his view at the time, wayward Jews were better to be stamped out and eradicated for religious reasons. Herod, on the other hand, after putting James to death, noticed that it pleased the Jews, presumably meaning primarily the leaders, and so he then proceeded to arrest Peter as well. His motives for doing so weren't due to some deeply held but misguided religious conviction. Rather, they were simply to improve their view of him and his actions as one in power. That is to say, his reasons for arresting Peter were political in nature. Peter at this point was no stranger to being imprisoned. Likewise, however, he was also no stranger to escaping from prison. Clearly this, coupled with some level of a fear of sparking riots, served in some way as the driving force behind such a large security force, as 4 squads of soldiers were tasked with ensuring that he remained incarcerated. Meanwhile, the reaction of the church to all this was to utilize that which was perhaps one of their greatest weapons, not to storm the jail and attempt to break Peter free, not to riot in the streets demanding his release, and on the opposite hand, not to cower and fear, but rather to pray. They knew and they understood, perhaps better than even we do today, that prayer had a tremendous impact. It wasn't their last resort. It was their first line of defense. Verse 6. On the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. And he struck Peter's side and woke him up, saying, "Get up quickly." And his chains fell off his hands. Despite being taken into custody, despite being treated as a criminal, despite being chained and monitored by multiple guards, and last but not least, despite being on the eve of his execution, Peter was at peace. In fact, in some ways, this seems reminiscent of Jesus' sleeping through the storm on the Sea of Galilee in Luke chapter 8. Following Jesus' example, despite all of these adverse situations, Peter was able to even sleep in the midst of them, trusting that whether he lived or died, the Lord was in control. This serves as an example for us as well, even in the midst of great turmoil. As we trust in the Lord first and foremost, we can have rest in Him. Verse 8. And the angel said to him, "Gird yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went out and continued to follow. And he did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. When they had passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. Even in the midst of being imprisoned, the prayers of the early church were being answered as an angel came, awaking Peter and removing his chains, all while not alerting the guards who had been stationed around them. Understandably, this all was miraculous enough that Peter didn't even understand at that moment that what was happening was real, thinking it was all a vision. Yet even without understanding, he knew that God was at work, so he trusted and obeyed. As a result of that obedience, Peter received his freedom, and the iron gates of the city were opened before them as they approached. Verse 11. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. As miraculous as Peter's rescue was, this all, however, brings us to a place of contemplation. Within the same chapter, James had been imprisoned as well. Unfortunately, the outcome for him was not physical rescue, but to be martyred, just as Herod had planned to carry out for Peter as well. We don't always understand why outcomes are different for some and not for others. Some may be healed of afflictions or spared from sufferings, while others must continue through them. We do, however, know that the Lord sees the eventualities we can never see. His ways are higher than our own. James was martyred and went on into the Lord's presence. Peter was released now, but would one day meet the same fate of martyrdom as well. In both, however, God was glorified by the outcome. James's testimony of remaining faithful and strong even unto death rings down through the ages even until now. Peter's miraculous release testifies of God's goodness as well. For us, we can be encouraged to seek to glorify the Lord regardless of our circumstances, whether in health or affliction, life or death, prosperity or destitution. Our circumstances don't change God. God changes us in the midst of our circumstances. Verse 13. When he knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. They said to her, "You are out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so. They kept saying, "It is his angel." But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door, they saw him and were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. And he said, "Report these things to James and the brethren." Then he left and went to another place. Clearly, those present were shocked by Peter's presence at the gate. Undoubtedly, they had continued to be praying only to have the answer to those prayers standing just outside. In fact, the girl here referred to as Rhoda was so excited and surprised that she left him at the gate and ran to announce his arrival to the others present. Even after delivering the news, the others present still didn't believe her, but went so far as to believe it was an angel instead. Though admittedly, it's a bit unclear as to why they wouldn't have been eager to speak to an angel. This seems to be a reference to the idea that some Jews believed in guardian angels and that said angels would bear a resemblance to those that they were protecting. In any case, Peter was persistent and continued knocking until they opened the door and saw him for themselves. He then described for them how he was miraculously released before charging them with sharing the information. Interestingly, however, the text states that he did not then come inside with them, but instead continued on to another place. presumably to relay the information to someone else as well. Verse 18. Now, when day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. When Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards and ordered that they be led away to execution. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. Herod's reaction to all this wasn't to believe that he had been miraculously released, but rather that there must have been some form of betrayal or deception or treachery among the guards. He examined them, and of course, being unable to draw a confession out of them, he ordered that they all be led away to execution. Obviously, the escape of a prisoner was no small discovery, much less a prisoner as high profile as Peter was. Even with as much security detail as Herod had assigned to him, specifically, not to mention any other security he probably already had in place, God's plan for continuing to work through Peter wasn't impeded. Verse 20. Now he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and with one accord they came to him. And having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace, because their country was fed by the king's country. On an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. The people kept crying out, "The voice of a God and not of a man." And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. While we aren't afforded many details regarding the nature of the dispute between Herod and the people of Tyre and Sidon, it would seem, however, that the people had found themselves in need of his favor regardless, being fed by the king's country, as the text states. Herod was powerfully positioned, and in a certain way, he was leaning into that position as he came before the people, sitting upon the rostrum, or a raised platform that's usually used to deliver a speech or to receive an award. He even went so far as to dress himself in fine royal apparel and accept the praise of the people, declaring him to be a god. Out of all this display of pride and arrogance, accepting essentially worship as a god, Herod was suddenly struck dead and grotesquely was eaten by worms. Verse 24. But the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied, and Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. The inclusion of this phrase, "but the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied," draws an interesting contrast with this description of Herod's death. Herod's reign, even in all of his physical splendor and glory, had come to an end. His life, even with all of the riches and power he possessed, came to an end. There was no level of political might, amount of popularity, or level of influence that could save him. Within the frame of the physical illustration that's given, as grotesque as it may be, the legacy that he left was all eaten by worms in the end. Yet the word of the Lord continued, growing, spreading, and multiplying as the church continued to grow as well. So this brings us to the end of chapter 12. In Acts chapter 13, Paul begins his first missionary journey, traveling and preaching the gospel along the way. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to stay up to date as we study the Bible together. Thanks for watching.